I'm Zach Martin. This is the Big Fat American podcast as heard on New HD. Right now, you can text New HD to 44321 and donate to a worthwhile cause, St. Sophia's Mission. We try to create jobs for people on the autistic spectrum and with additional needs. That number again is 44321. You text New HD and make a donation. Simple as that. Paul Brannigan joins us today. He's an author. He's in London right now. And through the magic of technology, we're in the same room together. It's a biography of Eddie Van Halen called Unchained. First full-length biography of Eddie Van Halen, searching, affectionate, in-depth look at the remarkable life of a genuine musical virtuoso who changed the course of rock and roll. And Classic Rock magazine out of the UK says it's the game-changing guitar legend gets this book he deserves, diligent, researched, perspective, and well-written. Paul, welcome to the Big Fat American podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on, Zach.
The first thing I'm really curious about, I just assume that you spent your whole life in the UK. So you're born and raised in the UK in London?
Well, no, I grew up in Ireland, actually, Northern Ireland.
Oh, okay.
Technically, that's part of the UK, but we'll not get into that.
Okay. I get it. Yes, I understand.
And then I spent 1 year at college in Washington, D.C. in 91, 92. And then I moved to London in 95, and I've been here ever since.
Okay, great. So now I can probably get the idea of how you probably found out about Eddie Van Halen. It must have been a trip here into the United States, correct?
Actually, no. I was introduced to them by a school friend when I was about 13 or 14, and he had got a couple of older brothers, and they were into like Rush and Whitesnake and sort of hard rock bands of the sort of early 80s, late 70s. And then one day he produced Van Halen 1 and said, "You might like this." And I took it home and listened to it, and obviously, like everyone else who's heard Van Halen 1 since 1978, my jaw was on the floor. And it was just a sort of complete revolution in guitar playing and incredible songs and just such a sort of dazzling vision of Californian rock and roll.
All right, fair enough. So as you can tell, I have a little bit of an Irish background myself. Even though I grew up here in the United States, half the family claims to be Irish. The other half, I don't know what they claim to be. So I'm kind of versed in the Irish culture, and I know all about Father Ted. Just so you know,
that's all you need to know.
That's all you need to know. They got it down pat. I think it's probably one of the best comedies of all time. And if you're listening, you don't know what Father Ted is, the episodes are available on YouTube. You just have to give yourself a little bit of time to understand the Irish humor, and then once you do, it takes off. The funniest one is when he they all say, "So I hear you're a racist now, Father." You know that episode. Right. And that's all. We'll leave it at that. It is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life, that particular episode. And of course you got Father Jack. Now back on to this book, Unchained. What made you decide to write a book about Eddie Van Halen?
Well, I wanted to kind of have a large scale rock and roll story, basically. And it was my sort of opinion at the time that there wasn't a great and definitive book on Van Halen at that point. You know, there's a lot of books on Led Zeppelin, there's a lot of books on AC/DC, you know, a lot of the sort of the great rock and roll bands, The Who, whatever, Queen, Pink Floyd.
Beatles, of course.
Beatles, yeah, and no shortage of books there. Whereas Van Halen seemed a little starved compared to the size of the band and their sort of impact upon the contemporary music scene. And also, I guess, I like the idea of it being this sort of American dream story. These little kids coming to America with, the family came with like $50 in their pocket, came over to California, had their mind blown by rock and roll and, everything about sort of living in the golden state. And then pretty much set about exporting that American dream to the world. And, at a time when immigrants don't always get the best rep worldwide, it's nice to be reminded of what immigrants can bring to the world.
Yes, I would agree with you on that. And it's part of the American story. We're all from somewhere else. And if you come to the United States, everybody's, I started off by saying I have an Irish background, specifically German Irish, which is a crazy mix, with Russian. So I got the three of the most angriest mixes you can imagine, all in one person, and this is what we get as a result.
A lot of good drinkers, though.
Yep. Oh, forget about it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I could take my pick: vodka, beer, whiskey, and it's all good. Here is a legend about Van Halen that I've heard, and you could probably give me the answer on this. Very early, when they decided that they wanted to start a band, it was Eddie and Alex, and they wanted to call themselves Genesis, but then they went to a record shop and they saw that there was already a group, Genesis. True or false?
That is true. I mean, they already were using the name Genesis. Actually, they were already playing shows as Genesis, and yeah, one day they, were in a record shop, but I think Alex shouted across to Eddie, "Hey, look, we've got a record!"
Oh, great!
They realized that they were going to need to change it, and then they actually changed to Mammoth,
right?
And then they were forced to change that too by a sort of a more local band in the Los Angeles area, which is why Wolfgang has picked up that name for his own band now.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
Van Halen was, I guess, the third time around, third shot really of choosing name. It was actually David Lee Roth's decision or really choice to, call themselves that after that.
That's very interesting in itself that David Lee Roth would suggest that when you know the story, which is covered in your book, how David Lee Roth, he didn't pass their auditions the first couple of times, did he?
Yeah, that's right. And, it's funny, you don't see any mention of that in David Lee Roth's book, because David's not a man to admit to failure too often. But yeah, he failed his first two auditions for the band and they thought he was just awful. And then he went out and formed his own band with the sort of single intention of trying to show Van Halen that he could do without them. And all the girls followed Dave's band, which was Red Ball Jet, and all the boys who wanted to hear 20-minute guitar solos and drum solos followed Mammoth and Genesis. And then when they came together, it was something of a marriage of convenience, it's fair to say. And I think it was something a marriage of convenience for their entire career, really.
Well, there was a necessity at the time. This is much like how Ozzy Osbourne ends up the lead singer of Black Sabbath, in which he was the only bloke in town who had the PA system. Wasn't that the same thing for Van Halen or Mammoth and David Lee Roth? David Lee Roth had the PA system?
It was, yeah. I mean, Dave's father was a sort of quite a wealthy doctor, and he had sort of shelled out quite early on for a high quality PA system. And Van Halen were basically hiring it from him every weekend, 2 or 3 times a week, paying him $35 a time. So Eddie's theory, famously, was, we might as well get this guy in the band, and we'll save ourselves. We'll be able to pocket that $50 per gig instead of handing him $35 a time.
It's a good business decision, but what did Alex think about that?
Well, they knew that Dave had got something about him. Even if he wasn't the greatest singer in the world, he was a showman. He was, a mouth on legs. Girls loved him, and he had no shortage of self-confidence. He knew no shame. Everyone who knew Dave from he was about sort of 15, 16 years old called him superstar. And he was just waiting for the world to catch up on, the legend that he was in his own mind.
So now we have Van Halen. Gene Simmons is in the mix. We'll get to that maybe later, but one of the interesting stories that Unchained covers is when Van Halen, and it's kind of interesting that we talked about Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath before we got to this, but Van Halen ends up going on tour with Black Sabbath, and I think Van Halen did very well, and I don't think Black Sabbath really liked that mix. Talk a little bit about what happened when Van Halen is in Europe, they were Black Sabbath.
Yeah, well, basically it started out because previously Sabbath had taken AC/DC out on tour. And obviously AC/DC in 1977 were feral. They'd got Bon Scott, they got Angus Young. They were such an incredible live band. So the story goes that, Sabbath sort of management said to the booking agent and the record company, look, let's have no more of that. We'll just have some little bar band from LA next time. And they were like, well, as it happens, we know someone who can fit that bill. And, the story goes that the 4 members of Sabbath were sitting backstage in Sheffield City Hall, heard this noise from out front, the roar of the crowd and this sort of ungodly guitar noise. And they sort of trooped out to the side of the stage to see what was going on and saw Eddie playing Eruption. And then as they sort of recalled, they saw the most beautiful man in the world walk to the front of the stage and sort of knock out in Talking About Love or Atomic Punk or whatever it was. And they all went back to the dressing room and sat there in silence and were like, man, we screwed up,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, they knew they were getting destroyed night after night, and there was some sort of irritation to the point where Tony Iommi had a quiet word with Eddie and said, "Look, don't, you know,
Don't upstage us. Yeah. Kind
exactly,
of.
yeah, like
Right.
have fun, but don't take the mic
Yeah,
over."
don't make it into your own concert. You're supposed to open up for us. And I guess, you have to sort of learn how to balance that I guess I mix if you want to be successful, because if you overstep your bounds, you're going to develop a reputation. Nobody's going to want to tour with you. That's a possibility, right?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, I think even on Van Halen's very first tour, they were out with Journey, and they sort of
Oh yeah.
realized they were pulling more people than Journey at the time. And I remember like Eddie sent a postcard home to a friend and said they would love to kick us off this tour, but we're selling more tickets and more shirts than they are. So
It's not the first time that this has happened in rock and roll history, and it doesn't mean that the band that Van Halen opened up for, or any band that opens up for another band, it means that that band quote unquote sucks or is worse. It's just one of those things that sometimes you pick the wrong star to get up on stage before you, and there's nothing you can do when you get up there after that happens. But then along the way, I do understand that Van Halen and Black Sabbath found some common ground.
yeah, I mean, to be honest, they bonded over quite a lot of pharmaceuticals more than anything else. But also, they were label mates, and uh, Tony Iommi really liked Eddie. He really respected him as a guitar player, really just liked him as a character. Much like him, he was a kind of a shy, humble, retiring guy, and all he was happiest sort of with the guitar in his hands. So, in fairness to Sabbath, they continued taking Van Halen out on the American tour, where, I mentioned in the book, I said they might as well have had a crime scene investigator following that tour around, drawing chalk outlines around Ozzy and Tony and Geezer,
Mhm.
because they were murdering them every night on stage. But they kept it up. They took them out there. And, when I talked to Geezer, he said, look, probably we should have risen to the challenge, but we were tired. We were fighting among ourselves. We were worn down by legal things. We were worn down by excess. Like, let them have their moment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can understand that. And you think that would make you play better. One player in the team makes you play better if that player is good, sort of deal. We're talking with Paul Brannigan, who's the author of Unchained. It is the first in-depth biography of Eddie Van Halen. I'm sure that if you're a fan of Van Halen, you're going to love this book because it's got all kinds of great stories, some that we just talked about. Others we're going to discuss in just a few seconds here. It's available on Amazon. It's available at Barnes and Noble. Anywhere else, Paul Brannigan, that's
Van
available?
Halen Store, I think, is probably one of the best places to get it. And, obviously the usual sort of online retailers.
Now, in the history of Van Halen, I know that Gene Simmons was involved. I think he somehow got the demo and got him signed to their first record deal, which I think is Warner Brothers.
Yeah, well, actually, no, it wasn't quite that. It was sort of that, but not quite that.
All
I
right.
mean,
Well,
what
you're
it
the
was,
expert on it, so yeah.
well, what was, yeah, sorry. What it was that Gene and Paul Stanley saw them play in LA. And even before the sort of final notes had fed away from the amplifiers, Gene was in their dressing room, and he signed them up to his management company and promised to get them a record deal. And literally that next morning, he took them down to a studio in Santa Monica, and they started recording like a 15-track demo. And they sort of ran out of time down there. And then he said, okay, I'm flying you up to New York. We're going to finish it up there. I'm going to introduce you to my manager. We're going to take over the world. And so they went up there. They finished the record, or the demo, up in Electric Ladyland Studios. And then they saw Kiss's manager, and he was like, nah, I'm not feeling this. I don't think so. And Gene Simmons is like, are you crazy? Listen to these songs. These guys are, the future of rock and roll. And Kiss's manager was like, no. And Paul Stanley was like, no, not hearing it. And so they passed. And like, Gene Simmons was crestfallen, couldn't believe it. Not as crestfallen as Van Halen were, mind you. But when I talked to both Gene and Paul for this book, Paul said, look, the reason that we passed on Van Halen was nothing to do with Van Halen and everything to do with Gene Simmons. He said, because, Kiss were going through their own sort of, troubled times at that time, and they needed all the focus to be on their own band.
Right.
And Paul Stanley said, the thing with Gene is, and this is, part of what makes him such a strong character, is he's often very concerned about Gene. And they didn't want him sort of taking his eyes off the prize that was Kiss and being distracted by this sort of shiny new object in the corner. And so, Paul Stanley said, were they great? Absolutely. Were they undeniable? Absolutely. Could we afford to have Gene distracted by his new proteges? No, not right then. No.
Well, I would agree that Gene is an astute business person. We'll leave it at that. Now, Electric Lady Studios is on 8th Street and 6th Avenue in New York City. So if you ever get the chance to come to New York, you want to go 6th Avenue, and you will make if you're headed north, you'll make a right. If you're heading south, you make the left if you're walking, right? And the first thing you'll see on the right-hand side is Electric Lady Studios, Jimi Hendrix Studios. And as you keep going east toward Thompson Park, you cross over First Avenue, right to the right is the Physical Graffiti building.
That's
so
right.
There's two great places to visit while you're in New York doing your rock and roll tour. And then around the block from Jimmy's is the Bitter End, which many groups have played at over the years. And then, also it would be a stopover in the 70s and up into the early 80s until it closed, CBGB's, which is right over there in the Bowery area. So there you go, a little geography lesson of New York and some of those places that you want to check out. Now, I do think that Eddie Van Halen, like most of us, and he is 10 years older than me, I believe, or was, he was a Kiss fan as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably impossible to grow up in America in the 1970s
and not be a fan.
Yeah, or at least not have a grudging respect for them, because obviously they were sort of larger than life superheroes.
Now, in your book, there's a story which Paul Stanley denies, but a story nonetheless that Eddie wanted to join Kiss.
Yeah, now Gene and Paul are at odds with this. Gene maintains that this absolutely happened around 1981, 1982, when the band were making the Creatures of the Night album. Eddie came into the studio and then he took Gene out for lunch and said, I want to join your band. I'm sick of Roth. I'm sick of fighting. I just want to play guitar.
Right.
Now, Gene swears that happened. And then when I asked Paul Stanley about it, I said, so, if that happened, so presumably Gene comes back from lunch. It's like, how was lunch? How was Eddie? And he doesn't. I said, did he come back and go, oh, you're not going to believe this. He wants to join our band. And Paul Stanley said, yeah, that didn't happen. And I said, well, Gene maintains it did happen. And Paul was like, no, that didn't happen. And he said, you can make of that what you will, but that conversation never took place.
Well, I'll never forget, it was New Year's Eve 1983 going into 1984 when Van Halen was on the radio and they released 1984. And I do believe that there was a tour involved, but soon after that, there's problems in Van Halen. You want to take us through that breakup with David Lee Roth?
Yeah, well, I guess there was already sort of tensions before that. It's a typical thing between the lead singer and the lead guitarist. I guess a certain amount of ego involved. Obviously, again, a lot of pharmaceuticals, a lot of excess at the time. But one of the things that was sort of a contributory factor, I guess, was that Eddie very much took control of the band on the 1984 album. He made it in his own studio, 5150, outside his house. He pretty much locked Ted Templeman, who was the record company A&R guy who signed him and the producer of all the first 5 records, pretty much locked him out of the studio and sort of did his own thing and only sort of allowed the others in when he needed them. And around that time, that album was hugely successful, obviously, only kept off the @1 spot in the Billboard 200 by Michael Jackson's Thriller, which Eddie obviously played on too.
I forgot, yeah, that's true.
At that time, DLR was allowed to make his Crazy from the Heat EP, 4 tracks of this sort of vaudeville and rock and roll kind of sound. And the weird thing is that, it's kind of odd in retrospect that Warner Brothers would allow that. This is their biggest rock act at the moment. They're the hottest band in the world at the moment. And you're letting the lead singer go off and mess around with a solo EP, which is only going to confuse people. And I think maybe in a way it was Ted Templeman's kind of shot across the bows for Eddie, saying, don't get too big for your boots. You're great, but he's great too. And you need him also, and you need me also. And, I guess sometimes tensions can sort of ratchet up unnecessarily. Maybe if they'd all taken 6 months out and calmed down and enjoyed their money and enjoyed the, time back with their families, they would have been able to sort of ride it out. But I guess, like I say, ego and chemicals combined and people whispering in your ear that you're the one, not him. And that led to the split.
Well, there's also the level of maturity at the time when we were in our 20s and 30s. We didn't always make the best decisions. It was a more of an emotional reaction instead of a thought out response. So there's that comes into play. So, um, long story short, David Lee Roth splits. There's all kinds of different stories about how that happens. And along the way, Eddie meets the Red Rocker, Sammy Hagar, who is the replacement for David Lee Roth. Now, what's interesting about this, we're talking to Paul Brannigan, who's the author of Unchained, which is available in Barnes & Noble and booksellers nearest you, as well as, I suppose, in the Van Halen merch shop. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Um, I one time had Vivian Campbell as an interview,
A
and
fellow countryman of mine.
He's a good friend of yours?
No, a fellow countryman.
Countryman, yes. And we were talking about the favorite, I guess, lineup for Van Halen: David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar. And I don't remember the answer, but I will tell you this: the answer that he gave circled the globe about 3 or 4 times, and every once in a while pops up again. And you can find it. I think Classic Rock Magazine picked it up. I know that is it Loudmouth or
Loudwire?
Blabber.
Blabber, yeah.
Blabber, whatever. I don't know. But there's all these articles, and I think it's one of the most fascinating things. And here's my perspective. Paul, you might have a different one, and this might go worldwide a few times like it did with Vivian Campbell. I always thought, while David Lee Roth is a great showman, Sammy Hagar was a superb musician and added a dimension to Van Halen and to that sound that was needed at that time in the mid to late 80s, right up until the 90s when he splits the band, whenever that was. And I like that, and I prefer that Van Halen. Very few people probably would say that, but I liked his musicality that he added to the lineup.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned age earlier on, because it seemed like when Sammy joined the band, it became age appropriate. They sort of settled into, it was, arguably better songwriting, certainly better musicianship. Sammy could do things that Dave couldn't do vocally, which is one of the things that Eddie kept saying, and which is one of the sort of reasons they got on like a house on fire at the start. I mean, personally, I would prefer the Roth era, because I guess it's the first one I got into. And also, I was still... I was 16 when 5150 came out. And at that point, Guns N' Roses were about to release Appetite for Destruction. And Guns N' Roses were savages. They were beasts. They were little rats on the street. And now, at this point, Van Halen changed to sounding like they were sounding sort of Jerry Bruckheimer movies and, Tom Cruise montages, whatever, blockbusters. And I preferred that sort of dirty, filthy, gritty, dangerous rock and roll that Guns N' Roses had at the time, and I can understand why people liked Hagar.
I hear your point, but now when I listen to it, even the Guns N' Roses Appetite for Destruction, I'm like, it's not as hard rock as I always thought it was. It's, I guess over the years I got so used to it that it doesn't shock me anymore. I do remember I was on a station, WZZQ in Terre Haute, Indiana, and we weren't even allowed to say the name of the band. We could only say Sweet Child of Mine. And then later the owner of the station said you could say GNR, because there was this, I guess we were afraid, or he was afraid of losing sponsors because of that image of Guns N' Roses.
Right.
And slowly but surely, when they realized, I guess, that Black Sabbath realizing that David Lee Roth was this sex symbol that the girls liked, as soon as the girls started to really like the Guns N' Roses and start requesting the song, and they saw the women responding to that, they lightened up. And then we could say Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction, talk about the band. Still afraid to interview these guys, by the way, because you never knew what they were going to say, and we didn't have delay at ZZQ. But yeah, you're right. There was this change. But I will say this: the first time I ever heard OU812, I was driving in my car in an area called Wildwood, New Jersey.
Okay, yeah.
And the first track that I ever heard from that album was Black and Blue. And I was like, this is effing fantastic. I was turning up that because also at the other side of it, Eddie stopped with the keyboards too much on that album. Remember, 1984 was all of these keyboards. I'm like, man, I really like it. knowing that he was actually a pianist at one point, started with the drums, just wasn't familiar with his background and what he was thinking. I'm like, this is a guitar player. What are you doing? But that OU812 is a fantastic album. Stands the test of time. And before that was the 5150. I do know that. So we put it a little bit out of sequence here. And then I did see Van Halen on tour with Sammy. And when I was younger with David Lee Roth, I enjoyed both concerts immensely.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, it was just different eras of the same band. But then right around, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the Van Halen expert on this in this conversation.
Well, we'll see. We'll see.
It was, I'm going to say 2004 when we have the Sam and Dave thing, right? Is that when they
Yes.
go on tour, 2004? And I didn't know if that was going to work. I heard all these rumblings of how they couldn't stand each other. I heard that there was this infighting, but for whatever the reason, it works somehow. But I think that in your book Unchained, you get more specific while about Eddie's, I guess, feelings about what went on. So give us a little bit about that 2004 Sam and Dave, Eddie, and what he thought about doing but decided not to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a difficult time for Eddie. It was a difficult time for Van Halen. I think they'd basically lost their record deal around then. You know, things hadn't worked out with Gary Cherone. They were in a bit of limbo really at the time. I think that was around the time when Valerie also left, and Eddie's marriage was falling apart, and he wasn't in a good shape, sort of battling with his different demons. And I think there was an element of sort of mischief, if not downright spite, in Dave and Sammy coming together, singing all Eddie's songs in arenas or whatever. I mean, they did not like each other at all. Their history they were clashing, those two, right from 1978. So again, a marriage of convenience. And I think there was a like I say, an element of just sort of nastiness slightly that they put that together. Champions of heavyweight rock and roll or something they were called. And Eddie at his sort of lowest ebb had to sit there watching these two guys who had walked out of his band, playing his songs in front of 5 to 10,000, 15,000 people a night. So that had to hurt.
Well, I would say that not only did it hurt, but it also, I guess, opened up his eyes a little bit. Maybe sobered him up a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, say that was such a difficult time. I mean, anyone who's read Sammy's book, read his autobiography, he talks about sort of meeting Eddie for the sort of 2004 reunion tour that they did, and he talks in sort of quite sort of brutal terms about Eddie's appearance and how badly he was sort of presenting at the time. And I talked, that was sort of really struck a chord with a lot of Van Halen fans and a lot of Eddie fans who obviously were used to this sort of cherubic, beautiful kid, sort of the big smile and the handsome features. And then suddenly here was the guy with teeth missing and, his shoes done up with gaffer tape and whatever, and just in a bad way. And when I talked to Sammy about that, he said, you know what? Like, people give me a lot of flack for how I talked about Eddie then, but actually I was being kind to my man. He was worse than that. And he said, like, I don't regret many things in my life, but I regret taking on that tour at that time. I should have said to Alex, you need to sort your brother out.
Right.
It's going to be 6 months, whether it's going to be a year.
Right. First things first kind of a deal, get him straightened out. I mean, there were times where Sammy, I think he said he was embarrassed to stand next to Eddie.
Yeah, which is,
right?
Quite a harsh statement. And he wanted to quit that tour halfway through, except that the sort of insurance, the sort of liabilities would have almost bankrupted them. There was, so much money riding on that tour.
Oh, yeah.
But he, I think he hated every moment of it, really.
All right. And in the book, you talk about in 2006 where Eddie, listen, it might make some people blush, but he was involved in an adult movie, Sacred Sin. But you know something? Instead of talking about it, if you really want to find out what happened, you should buy the book, Unchained.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of bizarre thing that, Eddie sort of let out his house with this director.
Yeah, well, you don't say anything. Let people buy the book so that they can find out what actually happened. And I think that, people will blush when they read that. It is so sensational. It is so intriguing. And don't tell your mom that you bought the book to read that part, and you might have to go to confession afterwards, Paul. But yeah, go get the book Unchained by Paul Brannigan. It is a definitive biography of the great Eddie Van Halen. It's a marvelous book, a great read, and you did a really good job. And I'm impressed because I I know growing up, we would study the bands from the UK here in the United States, and they become part of who we are, part of our rock and roll DNA. Never realized that what we have here in the United States is conversely true in places like the UK, London, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Scotland, any of those places. So, um, how many other bands can you say besides Van Halen? What are some American bands that have always intrigued you? Maybe a band that you wanted a book about or research.
I don't know. I mean, I think ZZ Top are a
Oh,
fascinating and
good one.
fabulous band. Obviously, MC5 and the Stooges, I've got a real sort of fondness for that. Obviously, Wayne Kramer's written his own book there, so there's no need for me to do anything. Aerosmith, obviously, but again, Stephen Davis did the Walk This Way book, so that's pretty much taken care of. So it's hard. I mean, I co-wrote a book on Metallica, and I did a book on Foo Fighters, and Guns N' Roses, I would love to do if I could get access to those guys, but that's not going to happen, frankly. But
Well, you never know. They might be a fan of Van Halen. One of them will read the book, and there you go. And you
maybe I'm not going to count not going to hold my breath for that to happen.
Paul Brannigan, what you need to do is always pay attention to your surroundings. I failed to follow my own advice. One time I'm at LAX. Now, give you my background. I used to be the host of Ultimate Classic Rock here in the States. You have Ultimate Classic Rock in the UK, which is a live concert sort of deal, I think. Yeah. And I was on Q1043 in New York, MMR in Philadelphia, some really big stations. And I've interviewed just about every artist you can just imagine, including at times the guys in Guns N' Roses. One day I'm at LAX. We're on our way to Disneyland. It's me, my wife, my daughter Sophie, and myself, and we're heading to get our baggage. And I walk right in front of this guy, and we both look at each other, and we're like, we both know that we know each other. We just don't know where.
Yeah.
But when it's at a place, you just cannot figure it out. So I go, "Hey man, how's it going?" He goes, "Good, man. How you doing?" I go, "Great. How's your family?" "Oh, they're wonderful." I go. He goes, "How's yours?" I go, "We're on our way to Disneyland." And he goes, "Okay, man. Well, all right. See ya. You have yourself a good day. Drive safely." Whatever the conversation was, small talk. My wife goes, "Who is that?" I go, "I have no idea. I just know that I know him and he knows me." It turned out to be Duff McKagan. So you just always have to pay. You never know. Strange things happen all the time. And I think if that's your goal in life, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, did you think you'd be writing a book about Van Halen?
Granted, no.
All right.
But,
So there you go. So
yeah.
keep dreaming that. I mean, it's fantastic. It's that Southern California rock and roll story that's part of, I guess, book 2 of Unchained. So you can call the next one Appetite or Appetite for Destruction or
I'll
Lies. There you go. GNR Lies.
For the idea, for the original
Yeah,
concept.
maybe we can co-write stuff. All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for spending time with us here on the Big Fat American Podcast, which is heard on the New HD Radio Network. For those listening, Paul Brannigan's book, Unchained, the biography of Eddie Van Halen. It's just an amazing book. You got to get a copy, especially if you're a Van Halen fan, especially if you say to anybody, when I grow up, I want to learn how to play the guitar. Well, you have to read this book. It's available at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, on the Van Halen merch site, right?
Yes.
Okay. You made it on the Van Halen merch site. It must be, really a book that the guys in Van Halen love, huh?
I mean, I'm not going to make that claim. I suspect that the merch site is somewhat independent of what Alex, and Michael Anthony do on a daily basis. So I'm not going to claim that would sound like an official endorsement.
You don't want to get yourself in trouble.
I don't want a lawyer's letter.
How does one follow you on social media, Paul?
You don't, because I don't have any social media. I can't stand it. I really.
Yeah, well, that makes two of them. I do because I have to. right?
Yeah, I know.
Oh,
In theory, I should, but I don't. I would cancel myself within about a day, and so you can't. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not anywhere actually online. But there's stuff. There's plenty of my words are online. If you wanted to Google my name, I wrote for Kerrang, wrote for Metal Hammer, wrote for Planet Rock. So there's no shortage of my stuff out there. There's a couple of other books out there. So yeah, I mean, if you want to get closer to me, the art is out there, but on a personal
fantastic.
level, I'm all zipped up.
Actually, I'm emulous of you that you were able to stay off of social media.
Well, I mean, I had one when I had my Dave Grohl book, and I found myself disliking my friends. Never mind
Oh
random
my
strangers.
gosh. Yes. Oh, okay. Let's just, this is like after the interview segment. Here's what people have to understand. You can have any opinion you like, and that's great. It's called freedom of speech. Here we have it in the United States, up to points. Freedom of speech is not unlimited. If you're listening, it's not unlimited. Your rights are not unlimited. This is crazy. I got my right. You do have a right to express yourself, and so does everybody else. And if someone thinks differently than you do, that's fine. Respect them if they're respecting you, especially. So it's a two-way street. Remember, no matter what side of the political aisle you are on, even though a lot of your points might be valid, the other people on their side have valid points too. If we can learn how to take the best of each side and put it together, then we've got something that will work for the most people. The other thing about social media and what people do on social media is they villainize everybody who doesn't think like them, thinks that everybody who doesn't think like them is stupid, or, they start the labeling stuff. That's not going to work. And even if you're trying to convince somebody to change their mind, 9 times out of 10, you'll never change their mind. So
Yeah,
either, understand that before you make the post, or don't make it at all if you can't take it. So just like little things. I use social media to keep in touch with people that I care about. I meet new friends. I sometimes meet new listeners. And I will say this, Paul, and I'm, 100% accurate on it. I never mention anything in the line of politics. Never do.
right.
I just stay away from it. It's like it's not going to be settled on Facebook or Twitter. If you want to make a difference, then you have to, here in the United States, you contact your representatives. I would say in the UK, you contact your members of parliament. I'm sure that
Yeah,
they listen to their people. That's what it's all about. So that's probably the best advice that I can give anybody who's, unhappy with social media.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, I just make my friends work a bit harder for our friendship. They
there
can
you
call
go.
me. They can
Right.
call me. They
They
can
can call
arrange
you. They
drinks
can
in
email
bars.
you. Yeah,
So,
those kind of things. Well,
yeah.
having said that, you can always follow me. Follow me at Zach Martin Rocks at New HD on Twitter and Facebook at New HD Radio. And also, you could find out more information at Sophia's Mission. Again, you can text New HD to 44321 and donate money that helps people on the autistic spectrum and with additional needs. Thank you very much, Paul.